This is the second week of the Sustainable Energy module, and this week we'll cover the following topics. Firstly, energy trends in Ireland. Secondly, the world energy outlook, what global energy consumption looks like and where it's heading. The third topics we're going to cover are population and economic growth as drivers of energy demand and emissions. And the fourth topic is continuing our discussion of energy conversions. So firstly, energy in Ireland. Now, first of all, before we start the full lecture, I'd like you to navigate again to Slido, sli.do, or www.slido.com on your phone or browser or wherever. You can pause this video if you like. Enter the event code SUSTN. And then there's a number of questions that will just get you thinking about the topics that we're going to cover today. So first of all, do you think that energy-related CO2 emissions in Ireland are going up or going down at the moment, according to our latest statistics? That's the first question. And then the second question is just an open-ended question. Why? What do you think is driving that? Next question is why? What is Ireland's main energy source right now? What do you think is our main sort of what do we consume? And then finally, does Ireland consume more electricity, heat, or transport energy? What's your impression? What is our main what's the main mode of energy that we consume in our homes, in our cars, in our businesses and industry, things like that? Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you won't be able to partake in this because the poll will be closed. So now we'll continue with the presentation. So the majority of these slides come from this report. So the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, SEAI, is a national body which does many things related to sustainable energy in terms of managing grants, doing policy analysis and things like that. But one of its main roles is to gather statistics on Ireland's energy balances. Energy balances are something that we'll cover in a later lecture. And this report from 2019 highlights some of the main trends of what's going on in terms of energy in Ireland and related CO2 emissions. Before we get into that, I want to go back to some of the definitions that we discussed last week. Firstly, primary energy consumption, when we're talking about an energy balance, measures the total energy demand of a country. So it covers consumption of the energy sector itself, so the energy sector being oil refineries, briquetting plants, things like that, and the losses during transformation. For example, when we convert gas into electricity, there's a large amount of energy lost, and also the losses in the distribution of the system. There's a loss also when we distribute, for example, electricity through the wires. And it also covers the final consumption by end users. What primary energy consumption excludes is energy carriers used for non-energy purposes. And the main thing there is, for example, oil products used in the production of plastics and other things like bitumen for roads. So there's actually energy embedded in those products that go into plastic, and those are not included in our primary energy consumption. So I suppose this is something about combustion, how much energy is actually used, and if it's still embedded in those plastic products, it's not used. Very confusingly, the term primary energy consumption differs from primary energy, which we introduced last week. Primary energy is energy embedded in natural resources, the primary energy that is in actually a lump of coal, gas in the ground, crude oil, that has not been subjected to any human-made conversion or transformation process. The difference between these two is the primary energy consumption looks at the national level and considers what energy is consumed by the country as a whole, and that might include, for example, oil products like diesel or petroleum, which are secondary energy carriers or usable energy that are imported to the country. It might include electricity imported, and those are secondary energy products. So primary energy consumption can actually include secondary energy if they're imported, and it also excludes energy that is produced in a country but exported. Secondly, secondary energy, also sometimes known as energy carriers or usable energy, are the more convenient forms of energy which have been subject to, that have been transformed from other primary energy sources through energy conversion processes. So electricity, hydrogen, petrol, biofuels, things like that are examples of secondary energy products. Finally, final energy consumption matters in an energy balance. Let me move my video. Is the total energy consumed by end users by sectors such as households, industry, agriculture. So we divide the sort of energy users into these sectors. Those are, as I said, the residential sector, buildings, transport. So these are the forms of energy which reach the final consumer's door and excludes that is which is used by the energy sector itself. Or is lost through conversion processes like electricity generation. So those end-use categories can vary and it can be confusing. So for example, you can break it down into buildings, which can be broken into private households, residential, commercial, services. You'll see all these terms when we talk about energy balances, can be divided and then into transport, road, rail, aviation, shipping, or transport can also be divided into private transport, transporting people, or freight transport, transporting goods. Agriculture and industry are also other sectors. So if we look at the key trends arising from SEAI's 2019 report, what happened to energy consumption in 2018? First of all, if you look at Ireland's economic growth, that's measured as a modified GNI, gross national income, which excludes the sort of effect of multinational. So this is somehow a measure of Ireland's actual national production, not just the sort of money that's passed through our economy and doesn't actually contribute to the economy. So in 2018, the economy in this form grew by 1.7%. And overall energy use grew by 1.6%. So you can see a very tight correlation between our economic growth and our overall energy use. These things have been very closely related. However, our energy-related CO2 emissions in this year fell by 1.2%, and we'll go through the reasons for that. If you break that down into the final energy end use, so in 2018, our residential energy grew by almost 7%, transport energy grew by 2.6%, industry energy grew by 4.7%, and services grew 6.4%. You can consider to yourself these make up the majority of energy end uses. So these sectors make up the majority of energy use. So why did overall energy use only grow by 1.6%? So have a think about that. At the same time, energy-related CO2 emissions didn't rise as much as energy in most of these sectors. So for example, energy-related CO2 emissions in residential sector was flat, but CO2 emissions from transport grew faster than energy use. Why might that be, you might think? Industry emissions fell and services emissions fell. Next, to go into the main energy flows in Ireland and how the energy balance is estimated. So if you can think of energy coming into Ireland and leaving Ireland. Energy comes into Ireland from abroad in the form of imports. Those either go to aviation, marine consumptions, or they go into final energy consumption, so directly importing petrol, kerosene, things like that. Or they can go into the transformation sector, which is, for example, natural gas going into the national transmission grid. We can import electricity. And equally, we can produce different forms of energy. We have an oil refinery in Ringaskiddy, different indigenous biorefineries, and we can export those to different countries as well. There's stocks, there's just literally storage of different forms of energy, and then final consumption for energy and non-energy products gets consumed by these different. This is how SEAI categorizes these end-use sectors. And this is a picture of the flow of energy consumption in Ireland, with primary energy requirement, which I talked basically all of the primary energy that we're consuming over here. Oil is the major energy end use. That answers one of the questions in the first quiz. So we consume over 7 million tons of oil equivalent of oil, about 4.5 million tons of gas, smaller amounts of coal and peat, and then these renewables here contribute a smaller proportion. So this section here is what is lost, what is not included in total final consumption. Total final consumption here is less than total primary energy requirement by about 2 million tons, because all of this is lost mainly by electricity transformation losses. That's heat escaping when you're burning fuels to generate electricity. But we also have certain amounts of losses from oil refining, briquetting peat. And natural gas sector actually uses itself, and there's certain amounts of losses as well. So the main end use sectors then: transport, residential, industry, services. Transport is the main energy user. Moving then on, these are the losses. This is a picture of the total primary energy demand in Ireland over time, and you can see some interesting trends here. So first of all, primary energy consumption or demand in Ireland was about 15 million tonnes of oil equivalent. So the same energy that is contained in 15 million tonnes of oil. And there was a 1.6% increase in 2018 on the previous year. That is mainly reflected by our growing economy again, until this year at least. So over the period 2005 to 2018, and you can, to 2018, primary energy fell in absolute terms by about 7.6%. And there's a few trends happening here. The main growth was from 2008 to 2005 to 2008. And then after 2008, obviously, a recession happened. But there's more happening than just the recession in these trends as well. The main fall between 2008 and 2014 was oil. So not only was there a recession, there were fewer cars and trucks on the road, but there was also a high oil price. There was a very strong, there was a huge increase in the oil price in 2008 related to many different geopolitical factors, and a high price meant that people consumed less energy. People's behavior adapts to price. So home energy, heating energy reduced, people's houses were colder, people took more energy savings behaviors, people drove less, because of that high oil price, but also because of the recession. And also there was a replacement of some of these fuels with renewables. But there was a return to growth in oil demand from about 2015, reflecting again the strong economy and falling oil price. Another thing to gain from this picture is that fossil fuels accounted for 89% of all the energy used in Ireland in 2018. We're still extremely a fossil fuel reliant economy. Oil, natural gas, here, and coal and peat. So you can see here that they account for nearly 90% of our primary energy requirement. And this blue here is renewables, and a tiny amount of non-renewable waste. Demand for fossil fuels increased by 0.1% in 2018, but fossil fuel demand was actually 15% lower than in 2005. So falling overall energy demand, and there's an increasing share of renewables, meaning that fossil fuels fell in absolute terms by 15% over this whole period. Coal use decreased by 34% in 2018. That's mainly due to Moneypoint, which is our main coal plant being offline. I'll go through that later. Peat use fell as well, and oil continues to be the dominant share, as I said, accounting for around half of our energy demand. Then looking at renewables, renewables actually increased by 10% in 2018. There was a very strong growth in renewables. Hydro and wind increased by 0.4% and 16% respectively, and biomass also increased its share as well by 11%. If we look then at where this energy comes from, the energy either comes from Ireland, that is our own national resources, that's what we call indigenous energy production, and you can see from this graph from 2005 that we have a small but steadily growing indigenous production of renewables. That's hydro, biomass, and wind primarily. Peat is another form of indigenous energy, but Bord na Móna has committed to ending the use of peat for electricity generation, and it's likely to be phased out as a heating fuel as well for various reasons. And one of the interesting things here that we can see is that we had a very small amount of indigenous gas reserve that was in the Kinsale field, which petered out to almost nothing by 2015, but then the Corrib gas field came online in 2016 and produced a large share of our gas consumption. If we look at energy imports, which are the forms of energy that we take from abroad, we import. Let's go back. So, indigenous energy production was around 5 million tons of oil equivalent, and imports was around 10. So we import about 2/3 of our energy consumption at the moment, of our primary energy demand, and that mainly comes from the from the Corrib oil field. That will be depleted, much like the Kinsale field, in the next 10 years or so. Unless a new gas field is discovered and exploited, which is unlikely under the current sort of political environment, then our indigenous energy production of fossil fuels will remain very low. Here, the forms of energy that we import has fallen by around 5 million tons since 2005. That's because of our falling primary energy requirement and increased production, indigenous production. Oil there has been falling. The gas demand, gas import has been falling because we're producing our own gas, and coal, we're importing a steady stream of coal, mainly from Colombia. There's also electricity trade between Ireland and the UK. Sometimes we are net exporters, sometimes we're net importers of electricity, and there's going to be a new interconnector with France online in the next number of years, which will have impacts on energy security, which is a future lecture. Next, answer to another question in the first quiz. What is our final energy demand in these three modes? Energy, heat, and electricity, heat, and transport. So transport has the largest share of final energy demand since 2014. Here you can see transport and heat kind of competing with each other for the largest share. So in 2018, transport accounted for 42% of final energy, closely followed by heat at 39%. Transport energy here, you can see, was very strongly related to the financial crash. That's because people were saving money, they weren't traveling as much, aviation demand was much lower, things like that. And heat there, this is actually adjusted for to account for variations in the climate from year to year, not the climate, but the weather. So if we have an exceptionally cold winter, then heat demand would increase, but this has been adjusted for that. So energy consumption and transport has been climbing steadily the last number of years, and we'll go through the reasons for that in this lecture. And heat final energy shows the greatest fluctuations because of the weather patterns. And heat demand as well was related to the recession, but also to oil prices, because heat is one of our oil is one of our main heating fuels. Electricity there, you might be surprised that electricity is the smallest share of final demand, accounting for only 19% in 2018. If you look at the equivalents in terms of primary energy share, you'd have the three of being around the same. That's because there's large amounts of energy losses from electricity, and if you add those on to the sort of energy production from electricity, then you'd have electricity being of the same order of transport and heat. Electricity has been fairly flat, but electricity consumption continues to rise slowly, and actually we're at peak electricity consumption in 2018, so it surpassed all the historical electricity demand in the past. Now we go through electricity. So this is the picture of electricity generation in 2018. These are the inputs to electricity generation, and this is the gross electricity consumption here. So this share of the electricity sort of pie is what we consumed and what we see in the final energy here. And the difference, as I said, is because of transformation losses. So we lost about 42% of the energy that went into the electricity system from these transformation losses, which is because of combustion efficiency losses and because of transmission losses. Natural gas is the main source fuel which fuels electricity generation. Coal there in 2018 was only around 11%. That was an unusual year for electricity generation because of reasons I'll get to in a minute. So if we point here to wind, accounted for 28% in 2018, and we're on track in 2020 to reach for that to reach 40%. So the wind industry in Ireland is absolutely hugely growing. We have a very developed wind industry, and we're on track for 70% of renewables in 2030 in our electricity generation, which is really going to be transformative. Something I'll note here as well is the electricity transformation losses. And why would you say is wind 28% here and 16% here? It's because we don't count any losses from wind. So the primary energy that goes into wind is the same as the energy that comes out in terms of electricity generation. Because we say that the primary energy from wind is that potential energy that the wind turbine consumes. I said that 2018 was an exceptional year for electricity generation in Ireland, and that's mainly because coal generation declined. Gigawatt hours there is how we measure electricity generation. So there was a decline in 1,500 gigawatt hours of electricity generation because Moneypoint, our coal power plant, was offline for most of the year because of technical kind of upgrade requirements and faults. So there was a huge decline in coal, a small decline in peat. We have virtually no oil in electricity. Natural gas consumption in electricity rose. That was to partially offset the decline in gas. Wind energy was the thing that really increased, that allowed us to generate to replace the coal requirement, tiny amounts of solar PV and other renewables and wastes, and we actually imported more as well. So these are the different, anything above the line there is something that increased relative to 2017, and anything below the line is what reduced relative to 2017. And because of these trends, this had a big impact on emissions from electricity. So here is what's called the emissions intensity of electricity generation. That's the grams of CO2 emitted for every kilowatt hour of electricity produced in the island. That is a measure of the intensity of carbon dioxide production from the electricity. And that has declined very dramatically since 2005. So our emissions intensity of electricity was around 630 grams in 2005, and that's reached new lows of 370 grams by 2018. Now in 2030, our target is around 100 grams, so that will need to keep reducing in the future. And the main reason why that has as the trend has been like that is because wind has been increasing and coal and peat have been reducing. So you see here that coal and peat, those are the most carbon intensive fuels, and they've been reducing. Now we get into heat. So what fuels our heat demand? This is our final energy requirement of heat, and there's been a big shift, or there's been some shift at least, from oil here to gas. So heat is what is mainly consumed in households, the residential sector, services, so public buildings and hotels, shops, things like that, office blocks, and then and public services, as well as heat consumed in industry. And there's been a shift away from oil towards natural gas. Oil is a more carbon intensive fuel. Natural gas is a less carbon intensive fuel. So the emissions intensity of heat has been also reducing. But then here you see a very small share of renewables in heat, and that's mainly in the form of biofuel. I mentioned there that the recession in 2008, as well as the climbing oil price, would have had an impact on this, but also we're seeing a return to oil demand growth in heat demand in Ireland. So this gives a picture of which sectors consume the most heat in Ireland. The residential sector there, households, are the main heat consumer, followed by industry, services, and agriculture and fisheries. Something to mention there as well, that when we use electricity for heat, so we often use electricity for heat in terms of just electric radiators or heat pumps, those are not counted as heat demand. So this is just heat from sort of combustion in the energy balance. Next, what are the main transport energy drivers? Here you can see private cars consume about 2 million tons of oil equivalent of energy every year. More, very significant, almost more than everything combined. About 40% of final consumption is private car use. Again, that tracked the recession, but we've been returning to growth in private car energy consumption. Something interesting here is that aviation has been growing very, very strongly, and we're at kind of record aviation energy consumption. We're traveling lots. The next tier is heavy goods vehicles. This here is fuel tourism. So when we estimate that trucks from abroad fill up their tank here because it's cheaper, and then they use the energy abroad. Something interesting here is that unspecified has climbed. So private cars, heavy goods vehicles, light goods vehicles, all of that. Those estimates they're modeled, and we don't know exactly. So we know that the overall fuel consumption has climbed, whereas kind of the models predict that these are falling, so that there's some unspecified part of the energy balance here. If we look at transport energy consumption by fuel, the main fuel there is diesel, followed by jet kerosene for aviation, and 16% is gasoline. Only 3% of our fuel mix there is biofuels, which is renewable, and those are obliged by suppliers. So suppliers are obliged to mix in biofuels with our petrol and diesel at the pump. If we look what's very interesting, what happened in 2020, obviously we've had a very strange year, and car traffic declined massively. And we just had a look month on month of diesel and petrol sales, and you can see here that in 2020 diesel sales slumped by more than half by April, when the height of the lockdown happened, and then recovered to normal levels around now. And petrol consumption declined very heavily as well, and are still at record low levels for August. Some interesting statistics for 2020. The reason for different trends in the transport sector are because of new car emissions profiles. So cars that we're buying are becoming more efficient. In 2007, there was a spread in terms of car sales by different emissions bands. Emissions bands measure in terms of grams of CO2 per kilometre. By 2017, 77% of cars were in the A band, and that has driven lower emissions from private cars. And 96 were in A and B band. So that means, so along with the emissions change, there was a big dieselization of the car fleet. These are new car sales by diesel and petrol type, and this other here is mainly EVs. So this was all related to a car tax change that happened in 2008, which incentivized lower emitting cars. That meant that the specific emissions, that's grams of CO2 per kilometre, fell from around 170 grams of CO2 per kilometre to 110 in 2016. However, these are test values. So these are the specific consumption, the specific energy consumption of the average new car. And again, the specific energy consumption for petrol and diesel has been falling because of those tax incentives. However, these are test values, and the on-road factors, we apply that when we're estimating actual on-road energy consumption, because there's a difference between the test values for cars and the real-world driving performance. So that gap was 8% in 2011. So we had to add 8% onto the test values. But in 2013, we had to add on 38% because just an international study showed that the gap between the test performance of cars and the on-road performance has grown very dramatically. And you might wonder why, if the efficiency of cars has grown so much, or the energy consumption per kilometre has fallen so much along with the emissions intensity of new cars, why are we at a return to growth for energy consumption in private cars? And that's because the total mileage is growing. So we're at about 35 billion kilometres that the car fleet is travelling every year, mainly driven by diesel cars. So, as much as we can save by efficiency measures, there's not that much we can do when we're growing in terms of the traffic on the road. To acknowledge again SEAI's very nice Energy in Ireland report for most of the slides in this lecture.